All right, so today let's do a deep dive into something I think we've all experienced. Procrastination. I was looking at all this research you sent over,
Right.
and it's fascinating why we put things off even when we know it'll just stress us out more. Our brains are playing some tricks on us.
Yeah, well, it's not as simple as willpower or just being lazy, right? Like when you look at the research, you can see just how much our emotions and like our survival instincts
Right.
are tied into procrastination.
Yeah, it's not always a bad thing, though, right? Sometimes it makes sense to rearrange your priorities and push something back. So, where's the line between smart prioritizing and true procrastination?
Yeah, that's the key difference, right?
Yeah.
Procrastination is avoiding something important, even though, it'll have negative consequences. That whole, oof, I should be doing this. But
Yeah, I know that feeling all too well. One of the studies you sent over actually uses this example
yeah,
of a report that's due tomorrow and suddenly anything else seems more appealing.
right.
Definitely been there.
And that's where the brain's threat response comes in. So our amygdala, which is like the brain's alarm system,
Okay.
it can trigger a fear response when we have a task we see as negative.
So you're saying that my brain basically reacts to like a work deadline the same way it would have reacted to a predator like way back when?
Exactly. Like evolutionarily speaking, that report triggers the same fear as if there was a physical danger.
Wow. Yeah, I can see how that would get my heart racing. But why does that make us procrastinate instead of just, buckling down and getting it done?
That's where things get really interesting. Our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that's in charge of rational thought, emotional control,
Right.
it basically gets hijacked by the stress signals coming from the amygdala.
So we're literally like short circuiting. Is there any research that shows this happening?
There's this study, it was really cool actually. They had students rate how stressful studying was, right?
Mm.
And when they were actually doing it, they didn't think it was that stressful. But when they were procrastinating, the idea of studying was super stressful.
Oh, so it's like our brains are making the task seem way scarier than it actually is.
Exactly.
And then it's not even that bad once you actually start
No, I don't know.
sneaky. So where do emotions come in?
Well, tasks that bring up feelings of dread or incompetence or insecurity,
Yeah.
those are much more likely to be procrastinated.
So like our brains are trying to protect us from discomfort even if it hurts us more in the long run. That seems kind of backwards.
It is kind of a paradox. And that's why it's not about being lazy, right? There's this strong link between procrastination and things like low self-esteem or difficulty regulating emotions.
So it's more complex than just laziness.
Much more.
Okay, so does that mean if our brains are wired this way, we're just doomed to procrastinate forever?
No, not at all. It just means we need to learn how to manage these tendencies.
Okay.
One of the most interesting things I found is this idea of the procrastination paradox,
Huh.
which basically says that a lot of procrastinators actually care too much.
Hmm. That's interesting. I always thought of procrastination as being linked with laziness.
It's a common stereotype, for sure. But fear of failure or perfectionism,
Right.
those can be huge drivers too.
Mm.
Some people put off tasks to avoid being disappointed if their work isn't perfect.
So a lot of us might actually be feeling guilty for the wrong reason.
It's very possible.
Yeah.
If you want to tackle procrastination, you need to first understand what's really causing it.
Less tough love and more know thyself, huh? Okay, but if our brains are literally fighting us, how do we break this cycle?
Well, that's what we're going to talk about next. Welcome back. Before we jump into breaking the cycle, there's something else I wanted to bring up. We've been talking a lot about like fear and how it drives procrastination. But it's not always negative emotions.
Really? You mean there are times when we're putting things off because we're actually feeling good?
It might seem counterintuitive,
Yeah.
but yeah, like fear and anxiety, they're definitely big factors.
Okay.
But sometimes procrastination is actually linked to positive emotions.
How does that work? Feeling good and then putting things off.
Well, sometimes it just comes down to enjoyment, right? Like we'll procrastinate on tasks we just don't find fun. Instead, we'll choose to do something that brings us like immediate pleasure or excitement.
So it's that classic, should I finally organize my finances or just scroll through social media for another hour
Hmm.
dilemma, the instant gratification trap. But how does that fit into all the brain science we were just talking about?
It's all connected to how our brains are wired. We're driven to seek pleasure and avoid pain, right? So when we think about a task and it seems tedious or boring, our reward system might not really activate, and we end up delaying it.
So that little dopamine rush I get from scrolling through my phone, that outweighs the benefit of getting my finances in order, even if it means I'll be more stressed later on.
Pretty much. It's like your brain saying, why bother with the boring stuff now when you can have fun instead? This is where something called temporal discounting comes into play.
Temporal discounting.
Yeah, it's basically that our brains tend to value immediate rewards way more than future rewards,
Hmm.
even if those future rewards are, like, objectively bigger or better for us.
So what's happening in my brain when I decide to watch Netflix instead of tackling my to-do list?
Basically, your brain's prioritizing that immediate pleasure you get from Netflix over the reward of completing your tasks, which might feel kind of delayed or less tangible, you know?
Mhm.
It's a classic short-term gratification winning out.
So we have fear-based procrastination and this pleasure-seeking procrastination. Our brains are busy.
Yeah, and it gets even more complicated because sometimes those two types can actually get all mixed up.
So I might put off that work project because it stresses me out and because I'd rather be doing something fun. Double the procrastination.
Exactly. And if you really want to figure out how to beat procrastination, it's important to understand which type is driving your behavior, you know?
Like we're peeling back the layers of the procrastination onion here.
Yeah.
So if it's more about I'd rather be doing something fun, how do we fix that? Do we just force ourselves to power through the boring task?
It's not really about willpower. You have to remember that we kind of have to work with our brains and not against them.
Okay.
So instead of dreading, like, a mountain of paperwork, think about how you can make it more enjoyable.
Yeah, but how do you actually make something that's just inherently boring more enjoyable?
Well, one thing you can try is pairing it with something you actually do enjoy.
Like putting on some music or rewarding myself with a treat after I finish a section.
Yeah, exactly. You could also try and introduce some kind of novelty to the task.
Okay.
Like break it down into smaller chunks and try approaching each one in a different way. That can keep your brain engaged.
Variety is the spice of life, right?
Right. And what about trying to shift your perspective on the whole task itself?
Oh, interesting.
Instead of focusing on how boring it is, try to focus on how good you'll feel when it's done. You know, think about those positive outcomes.
So instead of thinking about how much I hate doing the dishes, I should focus on that feeling of a clean, sparkling kitchen.
Exactly. And it actually works, like neurologically, because shifting your focus to the positive will activate your brain's reward system. And that can make the task feel much more appealing.
I'm all about the power of perspective, so it seems like the key is to really figure out our own personal triggers and then come up with strategies that actually work for us.
You got it. You got to be like a detective of your own behavior. Figure out what makes you tick and then use that to your advantage.
I'm starting to realize that procrastination is way more complex than I thought.
Oh, for sure. It definitely is.
Well, this has been super insightful, but there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. We've talked about our brains, our emotions, but what about the world around us? Does that play a role in all of this?
That's a great question. I think it definitely does.
So welcome back. We've been talking all about procrastination, why we do it, what's going on in our brains when we do it, and we even found out that sometimes procrastination isn't always driven by, like, negative emotions.
Right.
But now I kind of want to zoom out a little bit. Like, what about the culture we live in? Does that play a role in all of this?
Yeah, for sure. It's like, think about it. This always-on culture, the feeling that we have to be productive every second of the day.
Right, like there's no time to just be...
Exactly. And all these messages about efficiency and achieving goals and, you know, you go on social media and everyone's life looks perfect and they've accomplished all these things.
Yeah, and it just makes you feel like you're not doing enough.
Right. And all of that can lead to this pressure to perform, which can actually trigger that same fear response in the brain that we were talking about.
Oh, so even if we like our work, all that pressure can make it feel threatening, and then we end up procrastinating.
Yeah, and then you add in all the distractions of, you know, the digital age, notifications, emails, social media, everything's fighting for our attention.
It's true. It's hard to focus when you're constantly being bombarded.
It is. So it kind of makes sense that procrastination would be, like, thriving in this environment.
Right, like a perfect storm for procrastination. So how do we deal with this? Do we just have to, like, ditch all technology and become hermits?
I mean, a digital detox can be helpful sometimes, but it's more about finding that balance and being realistic.
Okay.
We have to be mindful of what we're taking in, and we have to create boundaries to protect our time and energy.
So, like, maybe muting those social media notifications or just checking email at specific times so we're not constantly interrupted.
Exactly. And it's also important to push back against that idea that we have to be productive every single minute of the day. Rest and downtime, those aren't luxuries.
Right.
They're essential.
It's like we need permission to just pause.
Exactly.
So what about when that pressure to perform just feels completely overwhelming?
It's okay to ask for help. you know, whether that's delegating tasks, talking to a therapist, or just like venting to a friend. Don't try to go it alone.
I think that's such an important thing to remember. Well, I have to say, this has been a really eye-opening conversation. We've covered a lot of ground here. Going from the brain science of procrastination to actually how our culture impacts all of this.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating.
And I think the most important thing is that now our listeners have some actual strategies they can use and a better understanding of their own procrastination
Yeah.
habits.
And that's really what it's all about.
Yeah.
Being able to break that cycle and approach your goals with more confidence and, be kind to yourself in the process.
So next time you feel that urge to procrastinate, just remember you're not lazy and you're not alone. There are things you can do to overcome it.
Exactly. Be kind to yourself. Experiment. Celebrate those little victories along the way.
Okay, any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up?
Well, I guess one thing to think about is, could it be that embracing imperfection,
Hmm.
even allowing ourselves to procrastinate productively sometimes,
Yeah.
could that actually lead to more creativity, more innovation? It's something to ponder.
That's a great question. Big thanks to you for sharing all these insights today.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
And to all of you listening, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.